what do you have to do to create a new exception publisher? What you have to do is implement an interface that they give you in one of these DLLs, and then create a publish method, because that's part of the interface, that accepts three pieces of information. One is the exception object, okay, and then there's some additional info that you can pass in as well. It's defined as a name value collection. It's one of these specialized collections that are part of .NET. Basically a key value pair. Okay. And then they will also give you the config settings that came right out of your config file as well. And I'll show you what that is used for. After that, once you got that information, it's just up to you to write whatever you're going to write. And that's just, we could use the SQL helper, for example, to insert into our error log table, for example. Okay. The additional info allows you to pass in any other information you want. Maybe you want to pass in the form you were on when the error occurred, the application that you're in when the error occurred, the username of who's logged in, right? You want to track it and see who is that guy creating all these errors. So you can go over and slap him. All right. Then the config settings parameter, that one comes in. That's, like I said, all of the attributes inside of our config file. We'll show you that in a minute. Some other cool stuff is for each of these individual publishers, you can tell it to include or exclude different types of exceptions. Okay? You can say, hey, you know what? I'm going to be really bad and I'm going to ignore all security exceptions. I don't want to know when people are, hitting my security exceptions. I don't want to know when somebody's getting a file I/O exception. You could exclude those specifically if you wanted to. Or you can go completely the other way and you say, you know what? I'm actually throwing a lot of errors. Okay? I'm generating them myself. I'm saying throw new application error. So you might want to include system.application exception and say only track those types. Okay? By the way, you can also put a little plus sign in front of here, and that means not only get an application exception, but get any exception that inherits from application exception as well. So if you're creating your own custom exceptions based on application exception, you will also track those. A lot of flexibility they put into this. So the first thing I did is I added a reference to the Microsoft Application Blocks .exceptionmanagement.dll. So I compiled this. It's out of my hard drive. In fact, I've actually given you the compiled version in the samples here. Okay, so if you don't want to go download it, these samples will work. They are there. Okay. Down here, I have my PDSA exception DLL, and this has the ones that, for example, this is my exception publisher that goes to email. This is the one that goes to the SQL Server. And I'll show you those in just a second. Then, what I have to do here is you have to set up what's called a config section. Okay? So actually this has to be the first thing right after your configuration in your app.config or in your web.config. Okay? This is exactly the same whether you're doing desktop or web. In the web, you'd put it in web.config, this config section. And you define a new section name. Give it a name. I called it exception management. Okay? When you see that, it means that somewhere down here, you have to have an exception management. Whatever this name is here has to match. It is XML, so it is case sensitive. Okay? Then you have to tell the section that, hey, when you find this section down here, there's a specific type out there that handles this particular section, and it's defined in Microsoft.applicationblocks.exception manager section handler. That is the actual class name in the DLL. Which DLL? You specify the DLL name here after the comma. Okay? Very intuitive, isn't it? I mean, this is probably the stupidest thing I've seen Microsoft do. We have attributes in XML. Couldn't they have just specified another attribute, DLL equals? Okay, instead of having a comma there? All right. Anyway, I guess some guy thought he was being slick up there. All right, so what happens? Down here in the exception management, we set up publishers. So the first publisher I have listed here has a mode, and I can set the mode on or off. Depends on whether you want the exception manager publisher to be called. When it's on, it's going to be called. Okay. Then here's where we can specify log name and application name. So if we wanted to create a different event source, you would change these guys. Okay. Again, which assembly does it come from, and what's the type that you want to call it? It's called default publisher is the class name. And it's going to instantiate a new instance of this and call the publish method on this. then I can add my own publishers. I can come down here and say, hey, I want another publisher. In this case, the assembly is PDSA exception. Okay, what's PDSA exception? Oh, it's right here. It's this DLL that I wrote over here. Boom. Okay, the type is in PDSA exception. It's EMSQL. EMSQL right there. That's the class that I want it to call if this mode is on. Right now it's off, and we're going to run this in a second. But I know that I'm going to write to a database. So if I'm going to write to a database, don't I need to know the connection string that allows me to connect to that database to write to that table? Where am I going to get that? Okay, oh, I could bury it down in the, hard code it down in my PDSA exception DLL. That's not too cool. So what I decided is, you know what, I'm just going to add an extra attribute here called SQL Connect. This will also get passed to my exception block. That's kind of cool. The last one here is another publisher. Again, the assembly is PDSA exception. The type is in PDSA.exception.em email. Okay, that's another class up there. And this one I needed some different information. I needed a from email, a to email, a subject, and what's the SMTP server to use to connect out. All of these will get passed to me so that I can grab them and then use the email publisher. All right, so let's actually step through this. Let's take a look at how this works. So the first thing we're going to do, the other ones, all the other publishers are off except for the writing to the event log. So let's go ahead and run this. So I'm going to go ahead and create an error again. Okay, it gets an exception. I call exceptionmanager.publish. Okay, and it passes to the default publisher. And then I just show what the error is. Okay, yeah, I screwed up. Okay, so now let's actually bring up my event viewer. And I set it to go to the application log here. And there it is. Okay, so this is the information it wrote. Okay, it says exceptionmanager.machine name. Gave me my machine name. The timestamp. Okay, the full name of where I came from. Gave me my thread identity, if I care. Actually, there wasn't a thread identity here. Gave me my Windows identity. Actually told me who I was. This is all a part of the default exception manager. They give you all this information for free. Then they tell you the exception type. Okay, so what I did was an invalid operation exception. That was the actual type. It gave me the message. Execute reader, command text property has not been initialized. Okay. And then it gives me the stack trace, source and all of that. Okay, but then it gives me the stack trace down here. So I get the full stack trace. Now that's great, isn't it? I mean, when's the last time a user gave you a stack trace? All right.
Okay, Paul?
Yeah.
You would have not placed anything in your config file. Would you have got that anyway?
Okay.
Or did you have to write that? Does the default mean?
The question is, if I would not have put any of that config section and exception management, okay, inside of my config file, would I have gotten this anyway? Absolutely. This is the default publisher, okay, and if you don't specify anything, it will always try to write to that event log. Yep. Good question. All right, so let's turn another one on. Let's turn on the SQL Server one. And let's take a look at how we write one of these exception publishers. And I think I have, yep, okay. So I'll turn this one on. Let's go ahead and, again, run through this. We're going to get the error. Okay. And what? I'm sorry. This would help if I restarted so I can reload that app config. Okay. Run this. Okay. So it hit the exception manager.publish. I told it that the SQL Server one was on. Okay. It then came into my EMSQL class. Remember, that's the one that I set up. Okay, so now it's coming into the publish method, and it's passed me the exception object. It's passed to me the additional info. I haven't used that one for anything in this particular case, but I will in a second. It passed me the config settings, and that is basically that snippet right here. It passed me all of this as a name value collection. Okay, so it passed me mode equals on. It passed me assembly, PDSA exception type, and it passed me SQL Connect in a name value pair. So what I can do is check and say, hey, is there any additional info here? No, it didn't get passed, okay. Oh, I'm sorry, this one did. Apologize. Okay. Then it says, okay, in the config settings here, what do we got? Well, I want to grab that SQL Connect, don't I? Because I know I need a connection string. It passed that information to me right out of my config file. Now it's just up to me to write some regular code here, isn't it? Insert into the error log table. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and format it. I'm going to grab my name, get my current name, date and time, the app name, and then grab the exception string. Okay. And then basically do my command object execute non-query. And I've now recorded that information in SQL Server. Now, not only am I seeing it here, right, but later on I can then bring up SQL Server. You could actually write some sort of little management app, couldn't you, to go out to this particular table and look at all your SQL Servers that errors you generated. So we'll drill down into Northwind. Again, error log is a table that I added to Northwind. It doesn't come with it, but it's part of that SQL statement that I gave you there. Okay, and there it is right there. Okay. And let's go ahead and actually expand this. So here you can see, it's the last one here. There's the full error information. I'll copy this and throw it in a notepad here. Voila. That's pretty cool, isn't it? Being able to specify that and put it into a SQL Server database for later. Okay. So the next thing